welcome to Lyric Lab Poetry. The subject of this video is a subject I've touched on previously in the Lyric Lab Poetry video series. It is lineation, and I will put a link at the end of this video to the video on free verse where I first discussed that. Lineation, what exactly is lineation? How does it affect the poetic line? And how can you practice good lineation? Well, the first thing to say is, in a piece of prose writing, or indeed in a prose poem, it is the right-hand margin of the page that determines where the line ends. And so really there's no determining factor other than that. In a poem written according to a received form, it will be the meter, the number of beats, and maybe also the rhyme that determines how and when a line ends before another one can start. But in a free verse poem, it's you, the poet, who determines where one line ends before the next one starts. And if you don't pay attention to that, it will appear to the reader that you haven't paid attention to it, that lines just seem to end randomly and start randomly. But by really focusing on what happens at the end of a line, then you can create suspense and tension. You can, in the reader's experience, you can also create additional layers of meaning that weren't there previously, and you can also just play with language in interesting ways that will get the reader thinking about the content and the theme of your poems. So I've got a couple of poetry exercises for you and also a poetry prompt. So the first exercise is to take a poem that you're not familiar with. The best way to do this is just to go onto a poetry resource like the Poetry Foundation or poets.org, find a contemporary poem by a poet you're not familiar with, and then paste that into a Word doc or whatever word processing software you're using, so that you can then delineate the poem. In other words, you're going to basically take away all of the line endings to create a block of text. The poem appears, therefore, as if it were a piece of prose. Naturally, it's better if you can do this in pairs, so that what you're actually presented with is just a poem that's already been delineated in that fashion, rather than doing it yourself. Because if you do it yourself, then when you come to the exercise, you'll remember some of the ways in which the poet had lineated the poem. So it's better to start from scratch. If you have a partner who can do the same exercise and then hand you their poem or the poem they've been delineating, then you can really start as a student without any prior knowledge of how that poem was lineated. The thing you're going to do next is to try to lineate the poem. And there are several ways you can do that. There's a wonderful archive article on the Poetry Foundation website. I will put a link in the description below the video. It's called Learning the Poetic Line. And that article references an exercise, a version of which I played in poetry workshops myself. This version is a little more advanced. It's by Catherine Wagner, and it relies on the 6 S's. In other words, she asks students to lineate this prose. So you've taken the poem, you've taken away all the lineation so it appears as a block of prose, and then you ask the student or the poetry workshop participant to lineate that poem 6 different times, according to 6 different things. And the first one is to lineate the poem according to speed, and then lineate the poem again according to sound, and then lineate it a 3rd time. So start afresh each time. The 3rd time you're going to lineate the poem according to syntax. And syntax is basically the way we put words together and punctuation to create good, strong sentences. The 4th way is to lineate according to surprise, and then the 5th way is for sense, and then the final way is to lineate the poem according to space, how you create and use space within the poem. So for each of those, speed, sound, syntax, surprise, sense and space, you're going to have to think about what that actually means in terms of poetry. How do you apply the idea of speed and velocity to a poem, and how can you do that through lineation? It's a really, really excellent exercise, and it also gets you thinking about your own poetry and your own poems and how you lineate your work. And it is really good to, if this is something you've never considered before, then you really should go back over the drafts of various poems you're working on and think and pay close attention to lineation. From my perspective, it's more often about surprise, how you can surprise the reader and how you create suspense and tension for the reader by keeping them hanging on that final word of one line before the beginning of the next line. So play about with that exercise and lineation. The next exercise is called breaking the line, and that's to write a poem in which no line ends with a hard stop. So the end of a sentence, for example, you know, in this exercise, it mustn't appear there at the end of the line. So in other words, no end stopped lines. You can maybe finish a sentence in the middle of your poetic line before continuing with a new sentence, but each line ending is therefore enjambed. So you have a poem full of enjambed lines where you get to the end of one line, but not the end of sentence, not the end of meaning. That continues on to the next line and on and on and on. What you can actually do is play around with writing a poem in one sentence and see how that works, breaking an entire sentence. And that's maybe easier to do with a very short poem, but try perhaps to write a longer poem that is a continuation of a thought or one that digresses. And just to give you a prompt, you could use a season of the year or a color. And I think the color exercise is great, just to start riffing on the idea of a color and its meaning and allowing that sentence to flow and not end until you reach the final line of the poem, which you are going to end stop. And the final exercise is to try to write a poem with one word on each line. I find this incredibly difficult, and because that means you are imbuing each word with kind of more stature perhaps than it deserves, and then maybe take that poem made up of one word per line and try to relineate with some of the words together on a certain line. You may even choose to use the same prompt, the color prompt, choose a different color and think about how you might write a poem with one word per line, and then play around with that so that you end up with maybe a short poem of, 6 to 14 lines, in which you actually break that rule and you maybe put a couple of words on each line, but you keep one line with one word. And I would suggest, therefore, that line is the one that needs to pack the most punch. It's really quite a kind of brave thing to write a line of poetry that includes only one word. So lineation, this is the beginning of an exploration that I may return to again in future videos, having touched on it with the free verse poetry video and this one. It's such an important thing to get right because the majority of poetry written today is free verse poetry. Are we really thinking about the different ways in which lineation can work for us and how we can put it to work for our poems? So thanks very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please do click on the like buttons and the subscribe buttons, and I'll be back soon with more poetry content. Thank you for watching.